Hi, I'm Dr Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician here at the RCH and your host today on the Kids Health Info podcast. Well, summer is finally here and the weather is warming up. We know that sun protection is important all year round, but particularly important at this time of year. And here to talk to us about SPF, which sunscreens to use and how to stay safe this summer is Head of our Dermatology unit, Dr Susan Robertson. Thanks for joining me, Susan.
Thank you.
From the Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne, this is the Kids Health Info podcast.
So we've seen in the news in, the last month or two, some concerns about sunscreens perhaps being mislabelled when it comes to the SPF content. And this has left parents a bit confused about what they can trust.
I definitely understand the confusion and the worry. Some things to point out is that all sunscreens that are primary sunscreen products in Australia are treated essentially as medicines by the TGA. So they are regulated. And a way to find out whether they are currently on the register is to look for their ARTG number, which starts with the letters AUST. So that should be on any primary sunscreen. And you can also look them up on the TGA website. So if they're registered for the TGA and on sale in Australia and they're not on the current recall list, they are safe to use.
That's really helpful that parents can actually look that up, and we can put some detail in our show notes about that for people listening. You've mentioned primary sunscreen. What are you talking about there?
So the primary sunscreens are the products that are regulated by the TGA as a medical product. You do have secondary sunscreens on the market, and what I mean by that are the products that are a moisturiser or your makeup, for instance, which has an additional SPF factor to it. They may offer some sun protective benefits, but they can't be relied upon as a sunscreen when you are going to be out in the sun for extended periods of time.
So a makeup product with an SPF factor, if I'm using that, that's not going to be adequate sun protection for me if I'm out in the sun. I should be using an actual sunscreen.
That's correct. And it's also, you should note that those secondary sunscreen products, they're not regulated by the TGA.
So what does that mean? If the TGA has regulated them, what does that mean?
It means that they have gone through a testing process where they've had their SPF substantiated. But the problems that have arisen recently that we've seen in the media is some of those testings has been inaccurate. And where they have uncovered that, those products have been recalled.
And so for those that are not recalled, we can presume that they're accurately tested and the SPF rating that appears on the product is trustworthy.
Yes, we can trust those products are safe to use.
Okay, great. So perhaps another useful thing to talk about is what SPF even is. What does it mean?
SPF stands for sun protection factor. And it's a measure of how much ultraviolet B light is filtered by the product. So an SPF 30 will filter about 97% of UVB rays, whereas an SPF 50 product will filter about 98% of UVB rays. So it's quite a small difference between those two products.
So that really strikes me because we had a lot of focus during recent questions around TGA-approved sunscreens and whether or not that testing was accurate, where products were marketed as SPF 50 and then in fact they were closer to SPF 30 when they were tested. But what I'm hearing is that the difference between those products, if enough of them is used, is actually quite small. And so parents should be reassured that they can go ahead and use sunscreen. And of course, either of those things is going to be vastly better than nothing.
Yes, that's correct. We do recommend the highest SPF that you can get, if possible, because it does recognise that most people are not putting enough of the product on. But rest assured, if you are putting enough product on, even an SPF 30 will be providing you a good level of protection.
Great. And you've mentioned UVB,
yes,
Susan. So what other UV is there? And, which are the other ones that we need to be worried about?
So there's UVA, which is the most common. UVB we've mentioned, and there's also UVC, which we don't really have to worry about because that doesn't actually reach us because it gets absorbed by the ozone layer essentially. So UVA is something we do need to be concerned about. It does penetrate deeper into the skin and can cause issues with sun damage and skin cancer, as well as things like ageing, wrinkles, things like that. Which
we don't want those.
Not desirable, that's right. So in addition to looking at the SPF rating on your sunscreen product, it's important to look for a product that says it is broad spectrum because that means it covers the UVA component as well.
And what about how much is enough sunscreen then? Can you explain that?
Yes, so for an adult person, you need approximately 1 teaspoon or 5 mils of sunscreen product per body area to provide adequate protection. So that's 1 teaspoon for the face, 1 teaspoon for each limb, and 1 teaspoon for the front and the back of the body.
That's quite a lot, really, actually, isn't it? I'm picturing my 5-year-old squeezing out a teaspoon per body part, and it's actually quite a bit.
Yeah, so for a 5-year-old, it'd be roughly half of that based on their body surface area.
Okay, great. So it sounds like from what you're saying that research or studies suggest that often we don't put enough on.
That's correct. And the type of product that you're using also matters. So a cream or a lotion is much preferred over, say, a spray aerosol, where you're actually going to be losing most of that product to the air and the wind.
Okay, because I have to say an aerosol can seem handy, particularly if you've got a moving target, like
Correct.
a toddler, for example. You feel like you can just spray them down, but what I'm hearing is that that's probably not recommended.
No, it's not.
Okay, because the product's going to end up in the air, not
The
necessarily
majority of it, yes.
on your child's skin. Okay, and what about reapplying sunscreen?
So it's important to reapply the product every 2 hours, particularly if you are in the water or if you're sweating a lot.
Okay, so that's going to be pretty often during summer.
Correct.
So talking a bit more about different types of sunscreen now, so we've talked about SPF. There's lots of discussion out there about different chemicals in sunscreen and whether or not they're safe, and also how different types of sunscreen work.
The main 2 types of active sunscreen ingredients are your chemical sunscreens and your physical, otherwise known as mineral sunscreens. They're both safe and they're both effective, and one is not superior to the other. And often a lot of sunscreens, in fact, will contain both types of active ingredients. The main differences are that the chemical sunscreens absorb the UV radiation, whereas the physical or mineral sunscreens reflect the UV radiation. And that can be causing some differences in the appearance of the product on the skin. So the physical sunscreens are mainly zinc and titanium, and they often leave a bit of a zinky look, or what's called a white cast, to the skin, whereas the chemical ones tend to be thinner and a bit nicer to use, I guess.
And so for children who might experience a sensitivity or an allergy, I know that's commonly a question you get from parents, would you recommend one over the other?
In general, if your child has sensitive skin, or if they're a very young child under 12 months of age, we tend to recommend the physical or the mineral sunscreens because they're better for the sensitive skin types.
That's really helpful for parents to know. So moving, I guess, a bit away from sunscreen, let's talk about sun protection a bit more in general. We're really trying to protect from getting sunburnt. So can you tell us a bit more about what that is and why that matters for kids?
Yes, so it's important to remember that sunscreen is only one aspect of your sun protection measures. There's 5 now. If you grew up in the 80s and the 90s, you might remember the Slip, Slop, Slap campaign. Added to that now is Seek and Slide. So I'll go through those. Slip-on clothing, which is long-sleeve clothing. UPF, if you can get it, which is UV photo protection factor. And then slop on the sunscreen, which we've spoken about, slapping on a hat, preferably a wide-brimmed hat that covers your face, your ears and your neck, seeking shade, so not being exposed directly to the sun where possible. Then the last one is slide on some wraparound sunglasses.
So you've got to be covered with all 5 elements. And can you talk about when it's important to use this protection?
It's recommended to use sun protective measures when the UV index is 3 or higher. And a lot of people don't realise when that is. So there are some helpful apps out there that can tell you, including the BOM or Bureau of Meteorology app or the SunSmart app.
Great. We've got a fact sheet with all of this information, and we can make sure we have links there to those apps as well. And in some recent research we did, we found that only 5% of teenagers knew that 3 and above is the level at which to actually use sun protection. So a lot of people not aware of UV ratings and what they mean.
And I think there are some other misconceptions out there too. So people think that when it's cold or it's overcast, you can't get burned, but that's actually when it's more likely that you will get burned, because people are more complacent about sun protection measures then. And the UV radiation does come through, and you can have a high UV index on those days.
And what about time of the day? Does that make a difference?
Yes, so the highest UV is usually between 10 and 2. And here in Victoria, when it's daylight savings time, that shifts between 11 and 3.
So that's the time to be really focusing on those sun protection measures. Okay. Now, there's a few more myths out there when it comes to sun protection, so we might talk about some of those. One of them is the idea that having a tan can actually protect you against the sun.
Yes, look, this is unfortunately not true. A lot of people think that it helps, but it doesn't. So there's nothing healthy about a tan. A tan is your body's response to sun damage. It's trying to protect itself, but it may only extend your time to burn by a factor of 2. So it's not going to give you adequate protection at all.
So a tan itself doesn't offer substantial protection from getting sunburnt. What about fake tan products, which we see being used a lot these days too?
Yeah, so similarly, having a fake tan, even though the skin may look darker, it doesn't offer any substantial sun protection. And when you have a fake tan or even a tan, you should be using your sun protective measures when you are exposed to the sun.
Great. So you're still going to need to actually apply sunscreen and all those other measures to ensure that you don't then go on to get burnt on top of that tan or fake tan.
Absolutely.
And what about the idea that you need to be sunburnt multiple times to increase your risk of skin cancer?
Also, unfortunately not true. There is recent studies that suggesting that one severe sunburn in childhood is enough to increase your lifetime risk of getting skin cancer. And in Australia, 2 in 3 of us will have skin cancer in our lifetime. It makes up 80% of the cancers diagnosed in this country, and it is one of the most preventable.
Wow, 80% is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
And what about children? I mean, do they get skin cancer? Do you see skin cancer in kids in your clinic?
Yeah, look, fortunately it's not a common occurrence, but I have, in my years of working as a dermatologist, seen a handful of cases of childhood skin cancer, including melanoma, and this is in children as young as 10 years old.
My goodness. And then, of course, in early adulthood, that's when we do start to see the effects of the sun start to become a bit more common.
Yes, correct. I've seen some young people in their early 20s who've had problems like actinic keratosis, which is a form of sun damage on the skin, and also basal cell carcinoma, which is the most common type of skin cancer.
Often as parents, I guess we feel like, you know, the risk of skin cancer, which is obviously that really main thing we're worried about when it comes to sun protection, is a long way away for kids and not something that we need to perhaps worry about now.
Yes, that's true. And for the young person themselves, it's not a risk that's realised until much later in life. So that is a challenge. And I think it's hard to get that message through. But sometimes we have families where there have been other members who have had skin cancers, and you find that the sun protection measures in their families are a lot better because of that and that increased knowledge. But I think it's also important to be modelling behaviours for our children, because they will do as we do.
Yeah, that's true in so many things as parents, isn't it? And sun protection obviously is just one of those. So how quickly can a child get actually, you know, skin damage or sun-related skin damage when they're exposed to the sun?
It can be as little as 10 minutes.
Another thing that people perhaps have questions about is whether or not you can actually get sunburnt through glass or windows. Do they offer any protection?
The windscreen may offer some protection, but UVA in particular will penetrate glass, and it is possible to get skin damage through the glass, absolutely.
I have seen a case once of a young child in the back of a car. It was quite a long drive, and they actually experienced quite severe sunburn on one side of the body because they had sun on them that whole drive.
And we do see this in adults who have occupations where they are driving a lot. They will have a lot more sun damage on their driving side.
Yeah, really hard to plan for that, but I guess something to be aware of in the car as well, making sure you've got a source of shade for your kids. So another thing, again, a myth, I guess, that we sometimes hear is to do with vitamin D. So can you talk us through vitamin D, the skin and sun?
Yes. Well, I think people probably overestimate the amount of sun exposure you need to make adequate vitamin D for our bodies. You can make enough vitamin D in as little as 10 minutes of sun exposure, and that's without sun protection on, and it's recommended that those exposures are incidental type, which is usually earlier in the day or later in the afternoon, missing that peak period of UV intensity. and having areas such as the face and the arms exposed. So 10 minutes on those shoulder periods of the day is enough time to make adequate vitamin D.
And is this different depending on your skin tone?
Yes, that is true. So people who have a darker skin type may need 3 to 6 times the length of time to make enough vitamin D. And of course, people who are culturally covering their skin, there is a risk for vitamin D deficiency, and it is true that some people do need to take the supplements.
Yeah, so from exposure to sun, that's one way we can make our vitamin D, isn't it? But it can be very safely kept at a normal level with a supplement as well. So
Absolutely.
perhaps for parents or of kids or young people who have concerns about low vitamin D, seeing their healthcare provider for the options, and it might be getting an over-the-counter supplement is the safest thing
Much
for them.
safer to take the supplement than to try and extend your time in the sun to make it up.
Absolutely. So even with the best intentions, Susan, I'm a mum myself, as I know you are, situations do arise where kids experience sunburn. Can we talk a bit about what you would do to treat that if it happens?
Look, yes, unfortunately it can happen. We do all get caught out. So for a mild sunburn, usually they can be managed at home. The main things are keeping them comfortable and well hydrated. So cool compresses to the skin can help to relieve that heat and pain. Pain relief like paracetamol or ibuprofen if necessary. If there's any areas of blistering, you don't need to pop the blisters. You can just let them settle down on their own. But I would advise if there is severe blistering, you should take them to see a health professional. They are also at risk of heat stroke, which can be presenting with unwellness, headache, nausea, vomiting, fever, and they should absolutely be taken to the emergency department.
And there's a couple of things that we hear about a lot when it comes to treating sunburn. Aloe vera is probably top of the list. Does this actually work? Do you recommend it?
Yes, look, aloe vera can be useful to help cool the skin down, and particularly if you keep it in the fridge or something like that, it can be very comforting, but it's not going to help reverse the damage of the sunburn or make it heal faster, unfortunately. You could get a similar effect by using a moisturiser that you'd put in the fridge.
Okay, and what about a steroid cream? Is there any role for that in helping that sunburn heal?
Yes, so sometimes a steroid cream can be helpful because the acute stages of sunburn is very inflammatory, and the steroid creams have an anti-inflammatory effect. So an over-the-counter product like a hydrocortisone 1% would be potentially helpful to use a couple times a day.
Okay, great. And as you've mentioned, it can be hot and a bit painful being sunburnt. What about putting on ice or ice packs? Is that recommended?
Yes, ice isn't really recommended, unfortunately. Although it may feel cool initially, prolonged exposure to the ice can actually damage the skin and you can get a cool burn. It would be much safer to use a cool compress, a cloth that you have put in the fridge, and then put on the skin.
So steer clear of the ice, even though it might feel like a good idea.
Correct.
So we've talked about lots of ways that parents might help to keep their kids safe in the sun. Obviously, kids spend a lot of time at school, so whether that or childcare or kindergarten. What advice have you got there about being sun smart and helping your kids to stay sun safe when they're in a school environment?
Well, a lot of the schools will have a sun safe or a sun smart policy, which is great. And there's certainly this no hat, no play policy, which is good. But I think it is important to educate your own child on the sun safe behaviours and also provide them with some sunscreen to take with them to school. In addition, on days when you know the UV index is going to be 3 or more, putting sunscreen on them before they arrive at school so that at least they've got a base layer of protection. At school, they're encouraged to put on the sunscreen, but if they're not able to do it themselves, it can be a bit challenging. So really reinforcing those behaviours and teaching them how to do it is important.
And what about the roll-on sunscreens? Because they can be a bit more practical maybe for kids at school. Do they work okay?
Look, you may not get enough product on with the roll-on sunscreens, but any amount of sunscreen is better than none. So if that's the only one you can use, choose the highest SPF and get it on the skin.
Okay, thank you. Well, hopefully with some of this advice we've had today, parents can, be on top of that, try as much as you can to follow those 5 sun-safe practices and keep your kids away from those risky situations where they're going to get sunburnt. Thank you so much for coming to chat to us today. Lots of myths busted, and stay safe in the sun this summer.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this important topic.
Information in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, discussions with your doctor or healthcare professional. If you have concerns about your child, please consult your local healthcare professional for individual advice. This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders. Kids Health Info is funded thanks to the support of the Royal Children's Hospital Good Friday Appeal.